Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of All For You. This will be part 15, day 31. Absolutely not, All Might roared, slamming his hands into the table and standing so quickly he almost sent his chair toppling for the fourth time this hour. Why ever not? All For One asked, with half-lidded eyes, swirling his cheap hospital coffee. If I am to be retiring, as you heroes so kindly put it, do you really think my associates will be happy to sit and let me do that? Some of them are going to be angry, you know. I need to be able to defend myself and Izuku. Sit down, All Might, one of the HPSC representatives sighed, sounding exhausted. We're never going to get anywhere if you keep yelling like a loon. All Might grit his teeth, the sound of his jaw creaking, vibrating through his skull. He clenched his fist, careful not to grab the table itself and break it a second time. He would lose his damn mind if All For One laughed at him like that ever again, although it already felt like he was losing his grip on it. I'm not convinced we're going to get anywhere ever, All Might snapped, and All For One tutted as if All Might was an unruly, stupid child, not the eighth holder of One For All, and the only person in the room who could cave his bastard face in any time he wanted. Come now, All Might, All For One said, slow, teasing, amused, just like he had the day he killed Nana. I'm sure we can come to an agreement once we all sit at the table and agree to stop breaking it. All Might wanted to fucking scream. When he had agreed to these negotiations, he had been expecting the All For One he saw in the hospital room, not this bastard. He had been so convinced that All For One was telling the truth, was being genuine, was actually capable of loving someone other than himself, that he fell for his tricks again. All Might half wanted to just cease this waste of time, drag All For One away from the hospital and end him now. But every time he nearly broke, something stopped him. All For One is a liar, unless it suits his goals. And like Nezu said, the only discernible goal All For One could possibly have or work toward in this scenario, a scenario where the symbol of evil begrudgingly agreed to give information but fought tooth and nail to stay in his wife's apartment, was to stay with his child. He had to care. Something in that rotten heart had to genuinely care for that baby. All Might would not end these negotiations before All For One did. That would be admitting defeat to All For One, and All Might was not giving an inch of ground. All Might grit his teeth and sat back down at the table. The HPSC representative sighed. All For One smirked. All Might clenched his fists so hard they shook. Although, All For One hummed, his smirk slipping away, it will be rather difficult to come to an agreement if you continue to refuse to give me anything. Nezu tilted his head curiously from the other end of the table, beady eyes blinking in interest. He said nothing, but All For One seemed to take it as permission to continue his monologue. I have already given you a large cache of information, as well as one of my most dangerous associates, he said, looking at them each in turn. And yet I've been given nothing in return. What you've gotten in return is not being thrown in Tartarus immediately and been given the opportunity to have this circus of a negotiation in the first place, All Might snapped. Oh, really now? All For One asked, taking a sip of his coffee. You gave that to me, All Might. See, I was under the impression that I was given these protections, and this opportunity from Tanima. Isn't that right, Ito? The social worker nodded next to him. All Might felt like he wanted to scream again. And yet, I have still given you and your associates what you desire, and got nothing in return. For this to really be called negotiation, some reciprocity has to be granted. A quid pro quo, All For One said. He grinned at All Might. You do know what that phrase means, right? At this point, All Might was pretty sure his entire body was shaking with rage. Nezu clapped his paws, the sound cutting through the tense air like a knife. Everyone turned to look at him. Nezu grinned cheerfully and said, We are getting nowhere. Thank you for the astute observation, Principal Nezu, one of the HPSC representatives muttered. Nezu ignored them. We will continue to get nowhere until we recognize where we are, Nezu said, his paws tapping the table. The click of claws could be heard in the silence. This is a table, not a battlefield. We're aware, Night-Eye said softly in the quiet. But are we? Nezu asked cheerfully. Because we are not acting like it. Giving ultimatums and refusing to compromise even a little is what occurs on the battlefields, where things dissolve into violence. That's not necessary here, is it? This is a meeting of equals, an unlikely group of individuals coming to work together for the benefit of an innocent child. But for us to get anywhere, Nezu said, looking at them each in turn, we all need to give a little to get a little. Nezu's words sat heavy in the tense air. All Might slouched in his chair, the anger draining out of him slowly. He glanced at All For One out of the corner of his eyes, watching the villain fiddle with his coffee, his eyes still half-lidded. All Might hated him. All Might hated him so much. All Might hated him for what he did to Nana, to Nana's family, to all the other innocent people he'd used and tossed aside callously. But this wasn't about All Might, or Nana, or even All for One. This was about the baby, about Izuku. All Might sighed heavily. Once again, Nezu was right. Night-Eye tapped away on his laptop next to him. Maybe we should discuss self-defense another time. There is a lot that we need to consider, and since self-defense seems to be a contentious topic. Izuku, All Might said. All for One stiffened, his eyes narrowing at him. All Might didn't waver. What does Izuku need? I hope you weren't expecting me to negotiate for medical access for him, All for One rumbled. All Might grit his teeth. Beyond the obvious. Does education count as obvious as well? Why did he have to make this so hard? Yes. There was some mumbling from the HPSC representatives, but All Might ignored them. All for One hummed, his blood red eyes shifting from All Might to the HPSC representatives back to All Might. Ah, so we're back to housing, are we? Lovely, he said. Housing would be a wonderful place to start, Nezu said, clapping his paws together. I sincerely hope Tartarus is off the table, Ito said. The HPSC representatives glared at her. Everyone ignored them. I believe it is. All for One, it sounds like you have given the topic some thought. Might you share what you have in mind? Perhaps something of a similar scale and nature to what you have already given, Nezu asked. As a matter of fact, I have, All for One said, grinning. Considering that what I gave up was access to my resources, I want access to the outside. All Might wanted to smash his head into the bedrock until he was no longer conscious. He wasn't sure if he meant All for One or himself. That is not related to Izuku, All Might snarled. You will not be allowed to wander wherever you want. A yard, All Might. All for One rolled his eyes. I want a yard for my child. If it makes you feel better to fence it, and so be it, but I will not have Izuku confined inside any more than his health demands. All Might deflated slightly, sitting back down. When Eddie stood up again. Oh, he mumbled. All for One raised an eyebrow. Yes, a yard is fine, All Might said. Wonderful, Nezu said. I think that is a reasonable and proportionate request that we can all agree to, no? And a playset, with a swing, All for One insisted. Nezu nodded after a small pause. And a playset, with a swing. All for One sat back, seemingly satisfied for now. All Might wanted to bury his face in his hands, but he refrained. Are we in agreement? Nezu asked. All Might and All for One nodded. After a moment, there was reluctant agreement from the HPSC representatives. I'll put it on the record, Night-Eye said, sounding somewhat relieved. Hizashi sighed as they closed the door behind him, finally tossing his cheap coffee he'd been nursing that entire meeting. It was always a relief to be done with those meetings, but today was especially relieving. It was good to be making progress, but exhausting as well. That and hearing Izuku's name out of All Might's mouth, well, he didn't like how easily the name seemed to roll off his nemesis's tongue. He better not be getting any adoptive ideas. Hello, Midoriya-san, Taro said in a sing-song voice from beside Izuku's incubator. How was the meeting? Good evening, Taro, Hizashi said, taking off his suit jacket as he walked over. It went fine, I suppose. So about as well as every other meeting, Taro quipped, and Hizashi chuckled. No, it went a little better this time, Hizashi said. He peered into Izuku's incubator. Izuku looked back, suckling on his pacifier. His voice started to play over the PAL machine, but Taro quietly turned it off so Hizashi could speak. Hizashi grinned and leaned down, cooing. Hello, little one. Did you miss me? Izuku blinked in response, his pacifier bobbing in his mouth. You know he did, Taro said, grinning. You're his favorite person. Hizashi blinked, looking up. He looked back down at Izuku, whose blue eyes stared back at him. Favorite person. All for One had never really had a favorite person, not beyond his brother anyway. Anyone else who earned the title of favorite person was just someone who had proven to be quite useful to his goals. Izuku was hardly useful to his goals. If anything, he was an active detriment. He'd already lost a lot of his empire because of Izuku, and the rest was on the chopping block. It hurt to give all that up, to let his brother win their eternal argument. But also, he didn't care. Izuku simply existed, and everything else became a second priority. He did not need a use. He did not need a purpose. He just was. And because he was his and Inko's, because Inko would have loved him with all her golden heart, Izuku had quickly risen amongst the ranks to be Hisashi's favorite person. Yet it was still hard to comprehend that Izuku might even feel remotely the same. Why would he? Hisashi was not Inko. He was not Mom. He may be familiar, comforting even, but Hisashi was not the one Izuku had known ever since his awareness first began to bloom. He was just the other parent. Not that babies even knew the concept of parents. So truly, Hisashi was just a slightly more familiar stranger to Izuku, even if he wanted to be more than that. No, Hisashi said softly. I think Inko is still his favorite person. Taro blinked. He smiled wistfully. Sure, you're not Mom, Midoriya-san, he said. But you are here. You're familiar, and you're here. That means more than you know. I suppose, Hisashi acquiesced. I'll be heading out in just a bit. He's almost done with his meal, Taro said, checking how much milk Izuku had left. Hisashi hummed. How much longer until he can take a bottle, you think? Not for a few more weeks, Taro said, starting to take apart the machine that fed Izuku his milk. His reflexes won't be ready to suckle, swallow, and breathe in the right order for another week or two. That's normal, for babies his age. That's all right, then, Hisashi murmured, looking down at Izuku. He couldn't help feeling a little impatient. He wanted to do more with his baby, but he can take as long as he likes, Hisashi said softly. Hisashi pulled himself away with a sigh as Taro wrapped up, walking to the bathroom to get changed out of his suit and into something more appropriate for lounging. Once he returned, Taro took his leave, and Hisashi resumed his post by Izuku's side. He looked into the incubator, chin propped up on a fist. Izuku was blinking sleepily, his eyes more closed than open. Hisashi smiled. Is the meal making you sleepy, little one? He asked softly, and Izuku blinked slowly again. His smile widened. I think it is. You look a little, what do they call it? Yes, milk drunk. Hisashi chuckled. What an idea, getting drunk on milk. But I suppose it's really just the same as taking a cat nap after a big meal, which you most certainly had. That was a lot of milk, Izuku. I'm mildly worried about being able to get a bottle big enough to match your appetite. Izuku's eyes slipped closed. His limbs shifted, too tired to keep his eyes open, but perhaps still willing to listen. He did sometimes play the PAL machine in his sleep, after all. Hisashi kept rambling. I'm sorry that I was gone for one of those meetings again today, Izuku. However, it was not a total waste of time. I managed to secure you a yard, and at the very least a playset with a swing. So don't you worry about being able to go outside, You'll have plenty of time for it, when you are all better. There was a knock at the door. Oh, I think you have visitors, Izuku, Hisashi said, grinning, and turned toward the door. Hello, who is it? Milk delivery, came a tired voice through the wood. Oh, Hisashi said and stood up, opening the door for Masaru to come in. The man walked in, a sizable cooler bag on his arm. Hisashi peered at him as he closed the door. There were bags under his eyes, and his skin was pale. There was a dullness to his eyes and a slow clumsiness to his movements. You look exhausted, Hisashi commented, and Masaru snorted. Katsuki doesn't like to sleep at night, and he's very loud when he's letting us know he doesn't like something, which is a lot of things, Masaru said as he bent down and put the milk in the freezer in the room. At least he's got a good set of lungs, Hisashi hummed. True, Masaru said. Can't take those kinds of things for granted. Hisashi thought of his son, sleeping behind him. No, most definitely not, he said. The milk going into the freezer never seemed to end. Hisashi shifted uncomfortably. You know, Hisashi said, watching the milk go into the freezer. Mitsuki doesn't have to give so much. Izuku may have a good appetite, but he isn't a big baby. I don't want Katsuki to go hungry. Oh, don't worry about it, Masaru said as he finished up. She has plenty. If you say so, Hisashi said uncertainly. Masaru gave him a tight, tired smile and nodded. I'd love to catch up, Hisashi, but I can't seem to get a break since Katsuki was born. I need to go do some paperwork, some shopping. Does getting any sleep fit into that schedule of yours? Hisashi asked. You look exhausted, enough that I might need to push you into a bed. Masaru blinked, sighed, rubbed his temples. Don't be a hypocrite, Hisashi, he groaned. I'm not, Hisashi protested. Masaru glared over his hand. When was the last time you slept, then? Hisashi straightened up, sending the other man a cocky smile. Last night, as a matter of fact. Masaru stared at him in disbelief. Really? Hisashi nodded. Masaru snorted and shook his head. How about I call you to push me in bed next time I go for a week without sleep? Hisashi deflated, pouting. Well, one of us has stamina quirks and the other doesn't. Well, one of us stayed up for a week twice and doesn't get to lecture me about sleep, Masaru countered, and Hisashi grumbled. Masaru laughed softly, sidling towards the door. We'll catch up next time, okay, Hisashi? Very well, but here, before you go, Hisashi said, quickly finding where he'd hung his suit jacket in the closet and rummaging in the pockets. He emerged a moment later with one of Nezu's business cards. He tapped a finger against a name written on the back in the Chimera's neat handwriting. The name of the restaurant you asked for a while ago, as thanks for all the milk Mitsuki's given Izuku. Masaru blinked, took the card and smiled. I'm sure she'll appreciate it, but that wasn't necessary, Hisashi. Hisashi shrugged. I feel like I owe you two, I suppose. Can't do much here, so it's the least I could do. You don't, Masaru said with a smile. Bye, Hisashi. Hisashi blinked. He smiled back. Until next time, Masaru. All right, listeners, this concludes day 31 of All For You. Hope you all are still enjoying this fic. As always, thank you so much for listening.